For today's seven or less, we're covering real covenants and equitable servitudes. So the first thing to understand is that these are just two different names we give to the same promise that someone has made about what they will or won't do with their land. The difference is in what remedy plaintiff seeks when she sues someone for breaking the promise. If she wants money damages, we say she's enforcing that promise as a real covenant. If instead she wants an injunction, she wants to stop the person from breaking the promise, we say she's enforcing it as an equitable servitude. So for example, let's say that you and I are neighbors and I promise you that I won't build a second story on my house so that I don't obstruct your views. Then I go ahead and I start building a second story anyway, and you sue me. If you sue me for money damages to compensate you for whatever losses you're suffering by me breaking the promise and having the second story, then we say you're enforcing the promise as a real covenant, have to run through the requirements to see if the promise qualifies as a real covenant. If instead you don't want money from me, you just want me to stop building the second story and abide by the promise, then we say you're enforcing the promise as an equitable servitude, and we run through the requirements for that. So on a fact pattern, if they tell you which remedy plaintiff wants, then you're just going to IRAC real covenant if she wants money, or equitable servitude if she wants injunction. If they're silent, which they often are, you're going to run through both. If they just say plaintiff is suing defendant for breaking the promise, you're going to say, well, if she wants money as her remedy, she's enforcing as a real covenant, IRAC that. And then on the other hand, if she just wants an injunction, she's enforcing as an equitable servitude, and then you're going to IRAC that. So let's talk about real covenants first. What's most likely going to happen on your fact pattern is that one or both of the original promisers is going to transfer their interest in their land before the promise is broken. So in our example, where I promise you I won't build a second story on the house, maybe I sell my property to Joe and he starts building a second story. And then you want to sue him for breaking the promise that you and I had. In order to do that, we're going to have to show that the promise runs from me to Joe. If instead, let's say you transfer your property, so let's say maybe you lease it to a tenant or you sell it or gift it or whatever, and your successor then sees me start to build my second story and they want to enforce the promise against me, now we have to show that the promise runs from you, the original promiser, down to them. So in either of those situations, we have to show that the promise runs with the land down to the successor. And in order to do that, we have to figure out whether that successor is taking over the benefited land or the burdened land. So all of these promises are always going to have a benefited or dominant land or parcel and a burdened, or sometimes we call it servient land or parcel. So in our example, you hold the benefited parcel. You get the benefit of having unobstructed views. And I hold the burdened parcel or the servient parcel. I have the burden. I am restricted because I can't build a second story. So let's say that you, the benefit holder, transfer your land to somebody new. Let's say you lease it or sell it or whatever, and you have a new person who is now taking over your interest in the property. And they see me building a second story and they want to sue me. In order for them to do that, they have to show that the benefit of the promise that you and I made, they have to show that that benefit runs to them. And in order to do that and enforce it as a real covenant to sue me for money damages when they see me building that second story, they have to show that four requirements are met. They have to show that the original promise you and I made was in writing. Two, they have to show that you and I, the original promisers, intended for our promise to run with the land and find successors. So maybe your fact pattern says that our written agreement said Emily and you and our heirs, assigns, and successors. Great fact to show that we intended it to run. Three, we have to show that the promise touches and concerns the land, meaning it's not purely personal. And four, we have to show that there is vertical privity between you, the original benefit holder, and your successor, the new benefit holder. So vertical, running down from you to them. So vertical privity is easy to satisfy. It means any voluntary transfer of the land. You might hear it described as a non-hostile nexus. It means that you voluntarily transferred your land to your successor. So anything other than adverse possession will satisfy this. Now, how do you remember that? Those four requirements for the benefit to run? Wait, I told Vera. Wait, writing, I, intent, told, touch and concern, and Vera for vertical privity. Now, if instead of having a successor to the benefited parcel of the promise, we have a successor to the burdened parcel. Let's say I sold my property to Joe and he starts building a second story. And you, the original benefit holder, you're still sitting there holding the benefit. You want to sue Joe, the new burden holder. In order to do that, we have to show that the burden of the promise runs from me, the original burden holder, to Joe, my successor. And to do that, we have 6 requirements. So the first 4 are the same: writing, intent, touch and concern, and vertical privity. The difference this time, because we're analyzing whether the burden runs, we have to have vertical privity between me, the original burden holder, and Joe, the new burden holder. So as long as he acquired the property from me through something other than adverse possession, vertical privity is satisfied. And then we have two extra requirements. We have horizontal privity. We have to show horizontal across privity between the original promisors, me and you. And horizontal privity is narrow and hard to satisfy. It means that you and I have a relationship regarding the land that is separate from the promise. So if we erased this promise, you and I would still have a relationship regarding the land. So it's very hard to satisfy. It's only going to be satisfied if you and I are grantor or grantee, landlord tenant, or mortgagor or mortgagee. So in our scenario where we're just neighbors, there's no horizontal privity, meaning the burden will not run from me to Joe, so you can't sue Joe to enforce this promise as a real covenant. The last requirement for the burden to run is notice. We don't allow a surprise burden. Can you imagine if you bought a house and started remodeling it, and then someone came up to you and said, guess what? You're not allowed to build a second story because the person that you got the property from promised that they wouldn't. Be like, what the, right? So we don't allow a surprise burden. Joe has to have notice of that burden at the time he acquires his interest in the property. So how do you remember those 6 requirements for the burden to run? Wait, I told Vera, hell no. Writing, intent, touch and concern, vertical privity, horizontal privity, and notice. Now, you may have a scenario where both the benefited and burden parcels are transferred to new people. In those situations, you have to IRAC separately, whether the benefit runs with the land to the successor to the benefited estate, and then separate IRAC whether the burden runs to the successor of the burdened estate. So that's how you enforce your promise as a real covenant. If you want to enforce it instead as an equitable servitude so that you are stopping the person and getting an injunction instead of getting money, then we have those same requirements for benefit and burden to run minus the privity. So you just erase the privity requirements. And that's how you do a real covenant equitable servitude essay.